I have come to the conclusion that one useless man is called a disgrace, that two are called a law firm, and that three or more become a Congress, and by God, I have had this Congress. For 10 years, King George and his parliament have gold-collied and diddled these colonies with their illegal taxes. Stamp Acts, Townsend Acts, Sugar Acts, Tea Acts. And when we dared stand up like men, they stopped our trade, seized our ships, blockaded our ports, burned our towns, and spilled our blood. And still this Congress won't grant any of my proposals on independence, even so much as the courtesy of open debate. Good God, what in the hell are they waiting for?
Sit down, John, you fat mother! Hello and welcome to Hamilton the Podcast. I'm Vinton Bain.
And I'm Robbie Herlocker, and this week we are reviewing 1776, an American Revolutionary musical.
1776 is a musical with music and lyrics by Sherman Edwards and a book by Peter Stone. The story is based on the events surrounding the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It dramatizes the efforts of John Adams to persuade his colleagues to vote for the American independence and to sign the document. Portions of the dialogue and some of the song lyrics were taken directly from the letters and memoirs of the actual participants of the Second Continental Congress. It premiered on Broadway in 1969 and ran 1,217 performances. The production was nominated for 5 Tonys and won 3, including Tony for Best Musical. In 1972, it was made into a film adaptation, and it was revived on Broadway in 1997. The 1972 film adaptation is directed by Peter H. Hunt. The screenplay by Peter Stone was based on his book for the Broadway musical. The song score was composed by Sherman Edwards, with the majority of the stage actors reprising their roles for the film.
That's right, 1776 is captioned as America's award-winning musical, and we watched 2 separate performances of this particular musical in preparation for this podcast.
We watched the aforementioned 1972 film adaptation, and then we watched a 1995 stage performance.
That's right, and you could watch that easily yourself on YouTube. It's presented by the Rochester Community Players back in 1995. It's a fairly fun adaptation. I actually really enjoyed being able to see how it's performed on the stage. The vocals and the recording was not exactly the greatest because it's obviously inside of a theater setting and the microphones are in the audience instead of on the stage, and it's a little difficult at times to catch exactly what's happening there, but it was a very well-performed piece.
I definitely appreciated being able to see both versions on film and live on the stage.
One of the things that's great about a movie adaptation of a musical is that instead of being confined to what you can do on a stage, you can go outside, you can expand the world a little bit and go out there and see what is happening around you. And they do that in the film version of the musical a lot by going into the streets of Philadelphia, and you get to see some more of the city that you don't get to necessarily see in the performance on the stage. But by and large, the film adaptation follows the script of the musical almost to the letter.
That's right. They have the same creative geniuses behind both, so they kept it very similar, telling the same story. Now, the main character in this musical is John Adams, but we won't be diving into a lot of his history because if you've listened to our episodes thus far, you know that we did a whole episode on John Adams already. So if you haven't listened to that one already, we would encourage you to go back and listen to that one and get the backstory on John Adams and his whole life, and then come check this one out.
That's right. So episode 18 of Hamilton the Podcast was dedicated entirely to the life of John Adams. And so this particular musical doesn't follow his entire life. It is rather an episode from John Adams' life when he is trying to fight to get the Declaration of Independence passed through the Continental Congress.
Now, the events of 1776 take place before our Hamilton musical, but Alexander Hamilton and John Adams' lives did intersect.
That's right. When Hamilton first arrives on American soil, you have the chorus singing 1776 New York City, and we already know that the Declaration has passed, but you know as well that later in the second act, John Adams is the one who has a lot of beef with his fellow Federalist Alexander Hamilton. They're 2 figureheads of the Federalist Party that bicker back and forth, and they have that interaction where Adams calls Hamilton privately a Creole bastard, and Hamilton then publishes this long statement in response that shows how much he aggressively hates this obnoxious and disliked character of John Adams. And in our John Adams episode, we did mention that there was a longer text in the Adams administration song of the second act that was cut from the Broadway version. We'd like to go into some of what those lyrics were before we segue into the musical 1776, because it's interesting to see some of the Hamilton-related overlaps that would directly relate to the main character of 1776, a musical.
And we're not going to break this down line by line, but we're just going to read through the lyrics of this cut song here. So from the point where Burr says, calling him the Creole bastard in his taunts, Burr says, Hamilton publishes his response. And Hamilton begins, an open letter to the fat, arrogant, anti-charismatic national embarrassment known as President John Adams.
Poop.
Yep, Burr says poop, but not like that. Hamilton again. The man's irrational. He claims that I'm in league with Britain in some vast international intrigue? Blank, please. You wouldn't know what I'm doing. You're always going berserk, but you never show up to work. Give my regards to Abigail next time you write about my lack of moral compass. At least I do my job up in this rumpus.
Ooh. Then he continues and says, the line is behind me, I crossed it again, while the president lost it again. Aw, such a rough life. Better run to your wife. Now the boss is in Boston again. Let me ask you a question. Who sits at your desk when you're in Massachusetts? They were calling you a dick back in 76, and you haven't done anything new since. You're a nuisance with no sense. You'll die of irrelevance. Go ahead, you can call me the devil. You aspire to my level. You inspire to malevolence. Say hi to the Jeffersons and spies all around me. Maybe they can confirm. I don't care if I kill my career with this letter. I'm confining you to one term, you fat mother. Boop. And so here in the fleshed out lyrics, you hear that Alexander Hamilton has a lot of beef with John Adams as president. He really levels a lot of personal attacks against him, and he has that line where he says, I'm confining you to one term, you fat person. And then in the final Broadway version, Lin-Manuel Miranda altered that final line slightly to give us a direct quote from 1776, the musical.
He shortened all this down to Sit Down, John, which is the first song in 1776.
Right, that monologue that we opened this podcast episode up with is the opening scene to the stage production 1776. And immediately after he says those lines, the musical ensemble, the rest of the congressmen in the Continental Congress, shout up to John, sit down, John, for God's sake, John, sit down. And they go through a whole song where they're essentially telling him that he needs to stop talking, he needs to calm down. Besides, it's really hot and they need to open up a window and there are flies in the room, and they're just talking about the context of how ridiculous it was to all be confined into this one room, and then they had to listen to this obnoxious man, John Adams, the entire time, and no one enjoyed it.
And I have a really hard time hearing this song while they're saying sit down, John, without hearing the Hamilton version, you fat mother. Now, before we actually dive into the main story here, there's a few notes I wanted to bring up about the movie version and a little bit about the stage version as well. The first one that caught Robbie and I's eyes was that watching the movie, Mr. Feeney plays John Adams.
That's right, William Daniels, the Mr. Feeney of our childhood, the one who all of us wanted as a principal when we were growing up.
Right. Unless, of course, you're a little bit older than us, and then you remember him from St. Elsewhere and not Boy Meets World.
Yeah, or from Knight Rider when he was the voice of the car.
Right.
And that was fun. When I first saw Mr. Feeney on screen in the film adaptation, I was initially surprised, and then I did remember, back to my Boy Meets World trivia, that the high school in which the students went to school was named John Adams High.
That's right.
And it's often been quoted as a slight potential reference to William Daniels' original role here on Broadway and in the film adaptation as John Adams.
And someone will have to fact check me on this later because I didn't go to look it up. But I remember watching Boy Meets World and Mr. Feeney teaching on the Declaration of Independence and the founding fathers that were there. And of course, Sean and Corey weren't paying attention and got in trouble during that moment. But I do remember that.
I remember freshman year of college, my college roommate and I would always stay up until midnight when the Disney Channel would start re-airing old episodes at midnight, and we would be in the room waiting until then. We'd put our homework aside, and we would focus all of our attention on rewatching the Boy Meets World series. It was fun.
Now, one of the interesting things about the film version is that they got to add in a few small things that they always wanted to do, which would later be picked up by stage performances after the film's release because they saw how great it was there and they wanted to do it in their stage versions. But in the original film release, there were also some things taken out. There was a whole song removed because of President Nixon.
That's right. President Richard Nixon was able to receive an advanced screening of 1776, the film adaptation, and he listened to the song Cool Considerate Men, and he thought that it was an attack on all things conservative. And so he reached out to the makers of this film, and he said, look, you cannot publish this scene. Even though it was in the trailer for the film, it was announced that it was there. People knew that that was a part of the musical. President Richard Nixon voiced his opinion, and he said, you need to take it out now.
And it was actually, I think, the studio head who ordered them to do that because he was friends with Nixon, and he ordered the film destroyed. Except when someone orders film destroyed, the person that gets ordered that usually goes, I'm not going to destroy this. Which is fortunate for us that they didn't. They put it in storage, and this film has been restored, and that song has been added back into our DVD versions.
Right. I'm grateful to that guy who just happened to pocket the film instead of destroying it like he was told to do. It's always fun when you have those little whistleblowers who save the day with publishing the deleted scenes.
Now, there are a few inaccuracies when it comes to the film and actual history. And I think the Columbia Companion to American History on Film puts it best when they said inaccuracies pervade 1776, though few are very troubling. Because Congress was held in secrecy and there are no contemporary records on the debate over the Declaration of Independence, the authors of the play created the narrative based on later accounts and educated guesses, inventing scenes and dialogue as needed for storytelling purposes. Some of the dialogue was taken from words written, often years or even decades later, by the actual people involved and rearranged for dramatic effect. So as we mentioned, the film version and the stage versions are almost identical. Therefore, we can run through one whole story and cover both.
One obvious change to the film adaptation is that they begin with a scene in the bell tower that only appears later in the stage production of the musical, but they quickly rush to the opening monologue from this episode and straight into the Sit Down, John song.
One of my favorite things about the film version there is that the camera, and I didn't notice this until I was listening to the commentary and they pointed it out, the camera follows John Adams from the top of this room in the bell tower all the way down these long stairs and then down this hallway into the Congress in one scene without ever cutting. And back then, they would have had a hard time doing that. They didn't have the machines we had now. They did it with a forklift and put a giant camera on wheels and had someone circling on the forklift. The forklift drops down and then they have John Adams straighten his coat as they come off the bump of the forklift so that it won't be noticeable. And then they wheel it into the room and it was all one long take.
Oh my goodness. I did not realize that. That's actually really fascinating.
Right?
And in a film where they have a lot of really harsh cuts that we'll probably talk about later on in other songs when we start getting into the meat of the musical, it's interesting to think that that scene was done in one shot.
Right.
So the setting for this musical, 1776, is one of the cities that is famously not a setting in Hamilton, an American musical, Philadelphia City.
Right, the city of brotherly love.
In David McCullough's biography, John Adams, he talks about how John Adams was incredibly impressed by Philadelphia when he first moved there for the Continental Congress. He was amazed at how it was laid out on a grid and how large it was, and he would walk the city often 5 miles in one night just to see everything there, get the lay of the land, and he was absolutely amazed at how awesome it was coming from Boston, where all the streets were kind of a spider web and it was kind of a weird layout where he grew up. And he thought, this is a great place. Philadelphia is a wonderful city. Eventually it started to wear on him and he really longed for being home in Massachusetts, home with Abigail. But the city of Philadelphia did leave a lasting impression on John Adams' life. I
can appreciate that. I'm from Oklahoma City. There's a grid system here. I go other places and there's not, and I get lost.
Speaking about setting, this entire musical almost entirely takes place in the chamber of the Congress, what we would eventually know to be Independence Hall. However, there are a couple little scenes where we go into the mall or we go to Thomas Jefferson's room and High Street and then the Congressional Anteroom. But besides that, the stage production is just in the chamber.
Right, and in the film version, they went through a lot of painstaking efforts to make the room look historically accurate, which I really appreciated.
The lyrics of the first song, Sit Down, John, really emphasize what it must have been like in that room. Because remember how hot it was when you went to summer camp and they didn't have air conditioning in the cabins where you had to stay? Yeah, they didn't have air conditioning here in Philadelphia either. All of them were sitting in the really hot room. The windows were often closed because they had an infestation of flies in Philadelphia that year. They thought that bugs were everywhere. They didn't want the bugs to get in the room. And so the Congress people are singing, "It's 90 degrees. Have mercy, John, please. It's hot as hell in Philadelphia." And someone keeps coming in and singing, "Someone ought to open up a window." And they are just constantly complaining because they have to listen to John Adams' speeches, and it's really, really hot. It's 90 degrees, and there are flies going through the room.
Right. The summer of 1776 was very hot for Philadelphia, especially for the delegates coming from the north. John Adams specifically complained to his wife in letters often, and one excerpt says, "Increase of heat in the weather and the perplexity in business, if that is possible, have become too much for me. We have had here a few hot days when Fahrenheit mercury was at 88. Now, 88 might not sound too hot to me. I'm in Oklahoma. It gets up to 110 here, but I have air conditioning.
You also don't walk around in frilly shirts and jackets and wearing a powdered wig on your head.
True.
And yeah.
You don't know what I do in my private time, Robbie.
So in the way that this opening song is performed, you have all of the congressmen speaking over one another. Some are complaining about the heat. Some are complaining about too many flies. John Adams keeps trying to keep them on point, saying, "I say vote yes, vote yes." And he keeps talking about the votes for independency. And eventually the Congress gets all their voices together and sings, "John, you're a bore. We've heard this before. Now, for God's sake, John, sit down." And they keep going back and forth. And John says, "Vote yes." They say no. He says, "Vote yes." They say no. He says, "Vote for independency." And then they turn their attention to opening up windows and complaining about the flies again. And so it's those types of things that lead John to say words like, for a solid year, they've been sitting here doing nothing in Congress. Because remember, the Boston Tea Party was 3 years ago, and the fighting at Lexington and Concord between the Americans and the British was about a year before this particular scene. And it's now 1776, and the Second Constitutional Congress, despite the fact that their armies are already engaged in war, despite the fact that General Washington is already in New York trying to defend the troops there, they are still debating whether this is going to be a civil war of Englishmen fighting for their rights as Englishmen, or a war for independency where the colonies are now splitting from their mother country, telling King George to beat it.
I really like this line in this song. "Consider yourself fortunate that you have John Adams to abuse, for no sane man would tolerate it." And it's going to be brought up a few more times in the musical where they call John Adams obnoxious and disliked. But actually, David McCullough, his biographer, says that this description of him is actually a description of him during his presidency that was taken from a letter. And now that we look back on it, it's easy to place it on him during the Continental Congress. But the reality is he was actually really well liked during that time.
Right. In a minute, we'll talk about the interaction between Jefferson and Adams when they're trying to decide who's going to write the Declaration of Independence. But looking back on that interaction, the elder Adams has a lot of self-deprecating things he says about himself. He talks about himself as an inadequate writer, which he was anything but an inadequate writer. And he talks about how he was unpopular, and really, he was one of the more popular people in Congress, serving on the most committees, I think, of the area. And he was heading up a lot of things. It spoke about the trust that his fellow congressmen had in him. If he was thought to be obnoxious, it would have been by only a few, and only he himself is known to have ever actually used the word of himself. So he is the only person in the surviving records to call himself obnoxious in reflecting back to this period of time. In fact, summarizing it all, David McCullough says the respect that John Adams commanded at Philadelphia that spring appears to have been second to none. But it's a huge point of our musical that we have to emphasize John Adams' pride, John Adams' arrogance, his obnoxious temper, where he keeps pushing the point when he really just needs to back off, according to some of these other people that are listening to him. Toward the end of this particular number, John Adams will storm out. He's really frustrated with the way Congress is responding to him, and he has this line where he's uttering a prayer to God. And we know from the records that John Adams was a very religious man. He, more than most of our founding fathers put a lot of effort into preserving his faith. And that was one of the contentions that he and Jefferson had early on when Jefferson spoke with this more humanist perspective. And then John Adams kind of expressed concern, saying, I've never heard someone that is such a smart man speak negatively about Christianity, and I'm worried about your soul. And it was a bit of a contention back and forth between Adams and Jefferson for a while. But here in the musical, John Adams storms out. He says, Dear God, for 1 solid year, they've been sitting there for 1 year doing nothing. And then he sings the words, I do believe you've laid a curse on North America, a curse that we here now rehearse in Philadelphia. And he says to God, a second flood, a simple famine, plagues of locust everywhere, or a cataclysmic earthquake, I'd accept with some despair. But no, God, you've sent us Congress. Good sir, was that fair? I think it's really funny that he speaks to God and he says, Congress is worse than a second flood, or a famine, or locusts everywhere. I'd rather have the 10 plagues come upon America than Congress.
Now, I think some people still hold that sentiment to this day.
I think that's absolutely true, and there might be some validity in their arguments. Ironically, moving into the song Piddle, Twiddle, and Resolve, John Adams has those lines that say, I say this with humility in Philadelphia. And if there's one thing that Adams is seeming to lack in this particular musical, is that humility. Abigail in the historical account frequently tells John Adams, John, you're being arrogant. John, you're letting your pride get the best of you. John, stop being so pig-headed. Later in this musical, she will address that again. But here he's saying, I say this with humility, which is a little funny to me.
Right. It's usually the people who are saying that they're saying something with humility who aren't being humble.
So in this, the second song, Piddle, Twiddle, and Resolve, John Adams is complaining about how little the Congress accomplishes. And there's this little interaction between a Congressman, John Hancock, and a Congressman Wilson that is described in here. And it's a little bit of a funny little interaction that illustrates how much they're willing to debate something that really doesn't matter.
Yet the congressmen are debating compensation for a mule dying while carrying goods for the Congress. And they're discussing whether the mule died while carrying the goods or after. Because if it died after, then it's its own business.
Right, which is a silly argument, and it's kind of ridiculous in the selfishness of it, too. Historical John Adams was writing back to his wife, Abigail, and he said these lines, which I think relate really well to this particular attitude toward Congress. He said, This assembly is like no other that ever existed. Every man in it is a great man, an orator, a critic, a statesman, and therefore every man upon every question must show his oratory, his criticism, and his political abilities. The consequence of this is that business is drawn and spun out to immeasurable length. I believe if it was moved and seconded that we should come to a resolution that 3 and 2 make 5, we should be entertained with logic and rhetoric, law, history, politics, and mathematics concerning the subject for 2 whole days, and then we should pass a resolution unanimously in the affirmative.
Right, so everyone has to speak eloquently, give their own 2 cents, and play devil's advocate, bringing up all these discussions, no matter how simple the question is. Having been fed up with the Congress, Adams retreats to the person that he can trust and rely upon, his wife Abigail. And the musical depicts them, even though in history they're writing letters back and forth, the musical depicts them talking almost face to face, but keeps that separation to show you that they are in 2 different places, but they converse back and forth.
Yeah, so they're trying to remind you that this is a letter correspondence, a letter from Massachusetts down to Philadelphia and back. Now, if they were to send letters that were as short as their lines that they say to one another, it would have been a little bit of a waste of time. But it's interesting to see them have a normal dialogue on stage in a way that you know it is letters corresponding back and forth.
In the film version, they represent this by having them obviously in 2 different locations, but looking at each other as if they're in the same room and discussing. And toward the end of the songs where they're having those letters, usually they end up in the same place, but they won't ever touch each other. Now, Robbie, how do you feel about the portrayal of Abigail Adams in this musical?
Oh, that's a great question. She is a wonderful character in history, and she's one of my favorites in the American Revolutionary era. And so it's hard for me to not be protective of how I view her historically when I see her portrayed fictionally on the stage. And it's a little bit frustrating to me in certain moments that they have her not playing as large a role as she possibly could. That said, she is obviously someone who pushes back against John Adams, compliments him, pushes against him in a really interesting way. But there are also moments when you see the 1960s coming through. Moments where you see the musical is not quite as progressive as Hamilton, an American musical. You don't see that she's coming in saying, hey, by the way, convince Thomas Jefferson to put women in the sequel of the Declaration of Independence. She doesn't have the strong feminist portrayal that you see on stage in our particular Hamilton musical. But that said, she is still a wonderful character.
And we did talk about in the Adams episode how instrumental and important Abigail was in Adams' life and his career.
And we also praised how intelligent and how wisely she managed everything, how she kept John Adams' law practice open when he was away in Philadelphia, how she tended to the farm while he was gone, how she took control of their family, making financial decisions, making health decisions, getting her family inoculated. She did some incredible, incredible things that you can read about in Founding Mothers by Cokie Roberts, or that you can listen to our John Adams episode and learn more about. In this musical, she comes in, and one of the things I find slightly problematic, it's probably nothing, but it's something that I considered a little bit of a disappointment when she comes in and she says, "My dearest John Adams, I know that this is tough on you, but it's really not as difficult as you're trying to make it." She says that you just need to tell the Congress to declare independency, then sign your name, get out of there, and hurry home to me. And she simplifies the idea, saying, look, you just need to do the thing, leave the room, and come back. And I know a lot of people levy this argument against Congress today because they're not really doing their jobs. They're like, if you just were to sit down and do your job, then you would have something a lot better to show for it. But in this particular moment, I find it somewhat problematic because the whole musical is dedicated to showing us how hard it is to pass the Declaration of Independence.
Absolutely.
And so when Abigail comes in and she's saying, look, there's nothing hard about this at all, just pass the thing. And the audience is supposed to understand that this is a difficult, hard battle that John Adams has to fight. And then it's almost as if Abigail doesn't understand that it's a hard, complicated battle with lots of different multifaceted interests here. And so I had a slight problem with that portrayal of the beginning of Abigail's character. But in that same stanza, she does talk about how the children have dysentery, little Tom is turning blue, little Abby has the measles, and I'm coming down with the flu. They say we may get smallpox. And so she's sitting here complaining about what's going on around her. And it is a little bit of an acknowledgement that she's the one having to take care of their household. She's the one that's having to deal with all of the stress that is left up at their family farm when John Adams is away. So it's a little bit of a give and take. You're not going to have your favorite woman from the American Revolution portrayed in a way that you will necessarily love every single time. But Abigail and John do share some really tender, intimate moments in this musical that I think are wonderful.
And they'll end their letter, or this song, I should say, discussing the need for saltpeter, which is a weird 3-beat that gets resolved at the end of the musical.
Yeah, John Adams asks Abigail to organize the ladies of the community to make saltpeter for gunpowder. That was one of the concerns that he knew they would need in the Revolutionary War. When he knew it was coming, he knew that they were already engaged in battle, and so in order to support the troops that were led by General Washington, they needed saltpeter for gunpowder. And Abigail says, "No, I haven't done that, John." And he says, "Well, why not?" And she says, "'Cause you neglected to tell us how saltpeter was made," which I was already a little disappointed in Abigail's portrayal. And then they're showing her as ignorant to how to do this. It was a little frustrating, but I digress. I'm sure someone that's listening really, really loves the character of Abigail in this musical, and they're really mad at me right now for saying anything negative at all. So I will say that the performance is amazing, and that the way that Abigail's character is portrayed is always with confidence, and is always with the idea of being someone that can push back against John Adams without any fear whatsoever, and with pure confidence in the moment.
Abigail does tell John that she won't make saltpeter, though, until she is sent pins.
I do like that she's here bargaining with John Adams. It's an interesting little back and forth where you see that she says, "Don't smirk at me, you egotist. Pay heed to what I say." And she just directly challenges him and says, every woman there has been searching for pins to be able to continue their sewing. And so she holds saltpeter over John Adams' head, saying, "I'll get you that as long as you give us pins." And so there's some of that back and forth, and I respect Abigail for that piece of saying, no, I'm going to stand my ground. I'm going to go back and forth. And they have that back and forth saying, saltpeter, pins, Peter, pins. And then John Adams finally says, done, madam, done. It's like he gives up because he knows that of the two of them, he's met the more convicted character of Abigail Adams.
And they end the letter saying, till then, I am as I ever was and ever shall be, yours. And John signs saltpeter, John. And Abigail signs pins, Abigail.
I really love the tender close to each of their letters that they sing when they say, I am as I ever was and ever shall be, yours. That's just lovely to me. To me, that is the Best of Wives and Best of Women of 1776, the musical.
Now the musical takes us to later that day, where Adams meets up with Benjamin Franklin. Here you have that scene, if you listen to our Adams episode or watch the Adams HBO miniseries, where Adams finds Benjamin Franklin getting his portrait painted and Adams is frustrated. And it's just as funny here as it is in the miniseries, even though it's set at different times. And Benjamin Franklin tells Adams that somebody else should propose the idea to declare independence, and it would be better received in the Congress.
When David McCullough describes Benjamin Franklin at the Continental Congress, he says that he was present nearly every day, notwithstanding his years and his infirmities. Benjamin Franklin was 70 years old, and he was popularly perceived to be the oldest and wisest head in Congress, which he was, and he was perceived also to be the most influential, which he was not. Franklin wanted independence, but couldn't even necessarily cement Pennsylvania, his own state, to be a vote for independence right at the beginning. And he also was someone who was patient and imperturbable. He really hated floor debate, so he never stood up and spoke, even though he was there every day in the sessions. He did fall asleep in his chair, according to David McCullough, and you see that on stage here where he's kind of falling asleep, he's not paying attention, and he didn't ever argue his point publicly. Instead, he really preferred to be the personal conversation person who did politics from behind the scenes, who did politics by getting other people involved and being that person who was actively engaged everywhere. He was America's most prominent, well-known citizen, and yet he didn't speak in this session himself. Instead, he went to people behind the scenes and orchestrated their involvement in the sessions. And that's what we see a little bit in the person of Richard Henry Lee in our musical.
Right. At that moment, when Benjamin Franklin proposes this idea, Richard Henry Lee shows up. And through questioning, Richard Henry Lee comes up with this idea that he should go and convince Virginia to propose the idea of declaring independence. But he thinks it's his idea, and Benjamin Franklin goes along with this. He's like, oh, I wish I would have thought of that, and smirks at Adams. I love that moment.
Yeah, that moment where you see a smug Benjamin Franklin who is very clearly playing Richard Henry Lee, saying, hey, I wish I could think of somebody who was from somewhere who was supporting independence. And Richard's like, well, don't forget that Virginia's supporting independence. And then he says, well, I wish that there was someone in Virginia that would be willing to propose independence to the Congress here. And he says, well, gosh darn it, if I haven't thought of somebody. And it's really a fun interaction. Richard Henry Lee is the character in this musical that I think would be the most fun to play.
Oh, absolutely. And this song coming up is his song specifically, and it may be the funnest song in the whole musical.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is such an enjoyable experience. One of the interesting things about this particular musical is that a lot of the show-stopping numbers are sang by secondary characters. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson have a few moments, but they don't have the songs like The Lees of Virginia, or He Plays the Violin, or Mama Looks Sharp, or Molasses to Rum. All of these songs are huge songs sung by secondary characters. In this particular song, he takes the lyrics and he says, my name is Richard Henry Lee, Virginia is my home. And he starts talking about how proud he is to be a Virginian and how confident he is that he will be able to deliver exactly what the colonists who want independence are desiring.
And so throughout the song, he's going to use words that could end with ly and insert his name into them. So Benjamin Franklin says social, and Richard Henry Lee says Lee. Benjamin Franklin says political. Richard Henry says Lee. Financial? Lee. Natural? Lee. Internal? Lee. External? Lee. Fraternal? Lee. Eternal? Lee. It's here a Lee, there a Lee, and everywhere a Lee a Lee.
Spoken modestly, God help us. John Adams' commentary on that. I really, really enjoy it. In the film adaptation, you see that the actor's eyes get big, his movements are large, he's flailing around the stage. The 1995 stage version that we watched also had a wonderful actor playing this role. It's such a wonderful performance in both of the shows we watched preparing for this episode.
Particularly in the film version. Particularly in the film version, you get a lot of close-ups on Lee's face, and he has the best facial expressions. There is a weird moment where he's getting on a horse here, and we mentioned this earlier. He's getting onto his horse, and there are like 10 scene changes as he's getting on the horse with close-ups on his foot, on his hand, on his face, back and forth within as many seconds. It's too much. It's crazy. So Lee rides off on his mission, and that takes us to our next scene.
Scene 3 moves us back into the chamber where we're going to meet more congressmen, and Dr. Lyman Hall comes in and introduces himself as a new delegate from Virginia, and he meets the congressional custodian, McNair, who's a fun little sprightly character in our musical, and they have some back and forth, and you notice immediately that everyone is interested in where he stands on the issue of independency.
Yeah, as they're going through asking where everyone stands on this issue, one of them claims to be the oldest, and someone points out, no, Benjamin Franklin's the oldest. And then at another point, one of them says a certain member is the youngest, and then he corrects himself saying, well, except Benjamin Franklin, who's also the youngest, apparently.
The man who's introduced as the youngest is Edward Rutledge, Ned Rutledge, who's one of the two men in this Congress that, according to David McCullough, John Adams actually really disliked. McCullough describes Rutledge as the youngest member. He says he was dandified, 26 years old, and overflowing with self-confidence. At first, Adams described him as smart, if not deep, but the more Rutledge talked, the more he expressed disagreement with Adams, the more scathing Adams' assessment became, to the point where, in his diary, he appeared nearly to run out of words, saying, quote, "Young Ned Rutledge is a perfect Bob O. Lincoln, a swallow, a sparrow, a peacock, excessively vain, excessively weak, and excessively variable and unsteady, jejune, inane, and puerile." He really doesn't like this Rutledge guy.
So as the Congress is discussing, John Adams is getting frustrated and wants to go off, but Franklin convinces him to wait a day for Lee to return. So Adams says, all right, I'm going to wait a day. And he remains silent for that day.
And Franklin compliments him, saying, "Congratulations, John Adams. You just made your first contribution to the cause of independency by keeping your trap shut." While they're having this debate, Richard Henry Lee comes in with his proposal from the Virginia House of Burgesses, and he starts reading this proposal for independence. And now that Virginia has put forward the proposal, they have to have a vote to see whether they will debate independency.
So a vote is taken, 5 colonies for and 6 against. However, New Jersey isn't there and shows up late and votes for. So now it's 6-6.
In the event of a tie vote, the presiding president of Congress, John Hancock in this moment, would get to break the tie with his own personal vote, which is definitely something that John Adams would be comfortable with, because he's a Massachusetts man. He is from John Adams' own state. He knows that Hancock supports independency. He knows how he would vote. But Dickinson also knows how Hancock would vote, and he immediately moves that any vote for independence must be passed unanimously on the grounds that no colony should be torn from its mother country without its own consent. And when they vote for that, it produces the same tie, and Hancock exercises his right to break the tie, not by supporting Adams, which makes him a little angry, but instead saying that, you know what, Dickinson is a little bit right here. I don't want to turn the American Revolution into a brother versus brother, colony versus colony conflict. He said, if we're going to put forward the idea of being a United States, we need to leave this room united. And so he also supports that this vote for independence needs to be unanimous.
And throughout this movie, Dickinson is portrayed as the one who's against these things and the antagonist, really, of the story. However, this is one of the distortions of history, because although John Adams is the one who's portrayed making these arguments against the abuses of King George, it was Dickinson's letter from a farmer in Pennsylvania that had originally made these arguments.
Well, Dickinson was clearly a true patriot looking back in history. He did have a moment on the floor where he and Adams got into a heated exchange where Dickinson said, "We need to give time for the possibility of peace. Yes, we're engaged in a conflict now that is bloody and that our brothers and our sons are going off to war and they are really in a dangerous place, but there needs to be the chance of reconciliation." And John Adams gets so upset, springs to his feet and yells at Dickinson, so much so that after the Congress closes down, Dickinson runs out of the room, confronts Adams and says, "What is the reason, Mr. Adams, that you New England men oppose our measures for reconciliation?" And Adams and Dickinson get into this personal back and forth where Adams is mad about the magisterial tone that Dickinson took with him, and then Dickinson is angry because Adams is willing to just rush off to war and ignore any chance of sending a peaceful petition to King George. And eventually, this personal conflict between the two of them gets so heated that Adams writes one day, I think it's in his journal, it might have been in a letter to Abigail, he says that he passed near enough to touch elbows with Congressman Dickinson, and he says this, "He passed without moving his hat or head or hand. I bowed and pulled off my hat. He passed haughtily by, but I was determined to make my bow that I might know his temper. We are not on speaking terms, nor bowing terms for the time to come." And so they had this really heated exchange. But because the respect for Dickinson was so high, Adams eventually had to acquiesce and had to let this olive branch petition be sent by his colleagues to King George III, proposing that there might be peace. King George III ignored and presumably never even read said petition, springboarding them to the events that happen next in our musical, where they have to go on with the debate for independence, knowing that peace and reconciliation is no longer on the table.
Now, Adams, frustrated knowing that they now have to come to a unanimous decision, has to think fast in this moment and decides to try to postpone for time so that he can have time to convince people. And he puts forth that they need some kind of declaration defining their reasons for independence.
So Adams and Franklin come to the conclusion that the way to stall is that they need to create a committee that will compose a declaration of independence so that everyone will understand exactly what it is they are declaring when they're voting for independency. In history, there were multiple reasons for why this declaration really needed to be written. First, you had the internal reasons for convincing people on the American side of the ocean that they needed to be involved in independence, that there were grievances that King George had committed that could not be forgiven any longer, that the colonies had concerns that were not being represented in Parliament or at King George's court. And they were saying in this declaration to all of the people in the American colonies, this is why we want independence. And so they were spurring forward people that might have been on the loyalist side to try to get more rallied up about independence, also spurring on the forces that are fighting under General Washington, giving them something to fight for, giving them a reason to stand up for their united, independent states of the United States. So there's that internal concern. But also, they had the external concern because they knew that they couldn't win this war alone very easily. So they wanted countries like France and Spain to be able to see that they were committed to being an independent state rivaling Great Britain. And so in order to do that, they put forward this declaration. And so in the words of Thomas Jefferson from our musical, he puts forward the justification for why they need to put these words on paper. And he says that it's to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent. So it was decided that this committee was going to get together and compose the Declaration of Independency. But who was going to write it?
So the committee is put together at this moment, and they go off to their next scene, where the committee of 5 argues about who should write the declaration in a song called But Mr. Adams.
We mentioned earlier that these proceedings that happened inside of the congressional committees and inside of the chamber were secret. Remember, we had a lot of British spies that were around that would have reported the treasonous activities happening here in Congress to the king and to his men, and the redcoats were on the American soil already, so it was a really dangerous time for these men. So all of their activities took place in secret. Most of our knowledge of these events came from journal writings of people like Thomas Jefferson later after the fact, or people reflecting on it later, or people writing in newspapers after the fact. And this is one of those moments where we don't know exactly how it is that Jefferson was chosen to draft the Declaration. The two people who were there, who had inside information to how the decision was made, have differing accounts to how the decision was reached. John Adams, when he was older, looked back and said that Jefferson proposed he, John Adams, do the writing, but Adams declined, telling Jefferson that he should do it. And when Jefferson asked why, Adams said, just essentially, reasons enough. And Jefferson went back with, well, what can be your reasons? And Adams responded with, reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. So just like we needed a Virginian to lead the masses with George Washington, just like we needed a Virginian to be in charge to kind of head up all of the support, he said, you're a Virginian. This will have more support if a Virginian puts forward the independency proposal and then the Declaration. And he says, reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I am. That's the account according to an elder John Adams when he's being a little self-deprecating. And remember, he was the only one who used that word obnoxious of himself. Jefferson never recalled such an encounter. He didn't remember that exchange ever happening. Instead, he just said that the committee met, simply unanimously chose him to undertake. He consented and drew it up. Pretty straightforward. No frills in Jefferson's account. David McCullough talks about how probably neither of their accounts were exactly perfect. Their memories probably were colored by a lot of the things that had happened between them, and possibly they were both correct in certain ways, that maybe Jefferson, out of respect, did offer it to Adams, and Adams declined, and there's no telling what exactly happened. But in our musical, we have an entire song of Adams passing the pen back and forth between other delegates who are proposed as writers of the Declaration of Independence. He says, you should write it because I'm obnoxious and disliked. You should write it instead of me. And all of them come back with, but Mr. Adams, and they have their excuses.
Jefferson's argument specifically is that he has not seen his wife for the past 6 months. He does not want to write this thing. He wants to go see his wife. But Adams reminds him, this is your duty, sir. You have to do this. And Jefferson's like, who's going to make me? And Adams says, I will. By force, if necessary. And it's a great moment because the man playing Adams is quite shorter than the man playing Jefferson.
Right.
And Jefferson towers over him, and Adams stands his ground firm, unwilling to back down from the very tall Jefferson.
I appreciate the response that John Adams has. It's a little bit crude and somewhat strange coming out of Mr. Feeney's mouth, but you hear him saying, Dear Mr. Jefferson, I am only 41. I still have my virility. I can romp through Cupid's grove with great agility. But life is more than sexual combustibility. Then you have people like Benjamin Franklin standing on the stairway, dancing the can-can, saying, bustability, bustability, combustibility. And John Adams has to quiet them and get them back on track again, saying, this is about writing the Declaration of Independence. And eventually, Adams does have the arguments to say that Jefferson has to be the one to write it.
So our next scene takes place a week later, and Adams and Franklin visit Jefferson to see how work is coming along with this Declaration of Independence draft, only to find that Jefferson is having writer's block and hasn't really written anything, just pieces of scribbles all over the floor. But Adams thought this might happen and had summoned his wife to come be with him so that he could get it out of his system, so to speak. Now, this isn't quite historical here. This is one of those pieces of the musical that twists history a little bit because Martha had just suffered a miscarriage and was also dealing with complications of gestational diabetes and was invalid in Virginia. She never came to Philadelphia.
This is one of those times we can give the writer of the musical a little bit of grace, though, for the artistic license, because in this you get to see that because she did come to Philadelphia in our musical, we get to have a couple little fun exchanges, specifically the exchange where Ben Franklin and John Adams are trying to introduce themselves to Martha Jefferson, and Jefferson and his wife are just in each other's arms, completely making out, unable to be interrupted, and they're completely avoiding any contact that John Adams is attempting to give them. He's saying, Jefferson, please introduce me to your wife. And they're just having to eventually leave the room because they are completely ignored now, because the only person who matters to Thomas Jefferson is his wife, Martha. The only person that matters to Martha Washington is Thomas Jefferson, to the point that when Benjamin Franklin introduces himself the next morning to Martha, she doesn't even remember him being in that room. They were completely distracted in that scene.
So closing out Martha in the musical, they'll come back to her and she'll have a song with Franklin and Adams where she dances around, talks about how Jefferson plays the violin and dances. And there's a lot of double entendre and innuendo throughout the song as the obviously pent up Franklin and Adams are looking at this beautiful woman singing and dancing.
That's right. I like that scene a lot. In this scene, we also get to have an interaction with John and his wife again. So this is the second scene where we'll see Abigail come into the scene, and she has this back and forth in the song Yours, Yours, Yours with John Adams again. And again, they're writing letters to each other, but they're singing in conversation.
Right. And on the point of Adams being pent up, Abigail talks about living like a nun, and John talks about living like a monk and how they miss each other romantically.
She says, I hate being celibate and solitary and living like a nun in a cloister. It's not what she was meant for. And then they have their 18th century version of sexting, I imagine, where she says, write to me with sentimental effusion. Let me revel in romantic illusion. And he writes back, do you still smell of vanilla and spring air? And is my favorite lover's pillow still firm and fair? Abigail responds, what was there, John? Still is there, John. Come soon as you can to my cloister. I've forgotten the feel of your hand. And John closes it out saying, soon, madam, we shall walk in Cupid's grove together. We'll fondly survey that promised land. This song is thick with the double entendres.
Ending with the title, till then, I am, as I ever was, and ever shall be, yours, yours, yours.
The euphemisms are heavy in that, but the romance is also very sweet, and I love that line returning again. I am, as I ever was, and ever shall be, yours. Reminding us again of the intimate friendship and partnership that Abigail and John had throughout all of their life.
Moving back to the Continental Congress. It's now June 22nd, and Adams is trying to win over some of the other states.
So here's the song that Richard Nixon had such a problem with. Dickinson comes in and he starts leading a minuet of people in Congress saying, we will go to the right, always to the right, never to the left. And he's leading the coalition of the cool, considerate men. And they have to keep reminding themselves that they're cool because obviously they're not that cool. And they say, we're the cool, considerate men. We're having level heads, cool tempers. We're just going to do the rational, patient thing as true, noble, loyal Englishmen. We're not going to commit treason like the rest of you. And so they have that whole scene where they start dancing in the chamber to the right, and they come into the streets and they're all dancing. And it's a really neat scene in the way it's portrayed in the film adaptation.
Right. They talk about their money quite often, and the song ends with a man sitting on the steps going, man, I wouldn't want to ask them for $1, which is a really funny moment.
Yeah, because you've just had this whole scene about how they want to hold on to their gold and they want to hold on to their lands, and they are, the conservatives of Congress. In the middle of all these debates on the Congress floor, we should mention that there are scenes like this moment where letters come in from George Washington, and he gives reports about what's happening in the Continental Army up north and what is going on around there. And leading into this, the final song of the first act, you receive one such letter from George Washington where he reminds us about what's happening in the war. And then there's this soldier who comes in and he sings to the people left in the chamber, which is McNair and a couple of the other workers that are in the room. And he describes from a soldier's perspective what it was like to see other people he knew dying on the battlefield. And he describes the final thoughts of a young dying soldier when his mother comes onto the field after the battle looking for him. And it's the thoughts that are going through this boy's head when he's wondering whether his mother will even find his body on the battlefield.
For such a lighthearted musical up until this point, this song is very dramatic and really gets me.
Yeah, this song is chillingly somber.
Our Act 1 ends here with this song.
I think it's an appropriate way to end this because it reminds the people that have been debating back and forth coolly and rationally about what is going to happen if we declare independence. Here you see a reminder that this isn't just a fake conflict or an abstract idea that we're debating. There's literally lives being lost right now as they're standing there leveling arguments against one another. It's a bit of a chilling moment to remind us that these arguments are happening while lives are being lost. So it kind of springboards, I think, a lot of the audience back into the mindset of saying, these debates really need to be expedited, really need to be decided, because Congress cannot just sit back and let their troops in New York be completely ignored any longer.
So that ends our Act 1, and that's going to end our episode for today.
Right, we'll follow up soon with what happens next when Thomas Jefferson finally gets around to drafting that Declaration of Independence. And we'll dive into a little bit more of what the Declaration of Independence means to America in that next episode when we wrap up the musical 1776.
This episode is brought to you ad-free by our lovely contributors on patreon.com. If you'd like to contribute to keeping Graphomania Podcast Network running, check out patreon.com/Graphocast, GRAPHOCAST.
If you've had the opportunity to watch 1776 the musical, we would love to hear your opinions and your thoughts about said musical, whether you've watched the film version, whether you were in a stage version, or what you happened to do that interacted with this musical. We'd love to hear about it if you reach out to us at contact@graphocast.com or hit us up on Twitter @graphocast. And you can reach out to us, tell us your stories about 1776, tell us what you think about it. And if you get this to us quickly, we may be able to fit in a couple listener responses as we try to wrap up and encapsulate everything that is 1776, the musical, in our next episode.
Now, Robbie and I, when we were watching the film version of 1776, live tweeted it and just pointed out some of our favorite quotes, some of our favorite moments. We used the hashtag 1776LT. 1776 LT.
So if you happen to watch the film version or even a stage version of 1776 yourself, and if you want to live tweet it as well, go ahead and use that hashtag and let us know. Give us a shout out on Twitter. I'm @AlphaKnight, and we would love to be able to look at your tweets.
And I'm @FleshEater. Also, if you want to just see what we said, make sure to look up that hashtag and you can scroll through our tweets.
Until next time, we are, as we ever were, and ever shall be, your Hamilton the Podcast hosts.
Yours, yours, yours. This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, GRAPHOCAST.com. Follow us on Twitter @Graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.